Hi, I'm Jeff Kreisler, Head of Behavioral Science at jpmorgan Private Bank. Welcome to jpmorgan's 2022 Summer Reading List series. We are thrilled today to be joined by one of the best-selling nonfiction authors of the last decade and one of the most influential management thinkers in the world, Daniel H. Pink. Dan is here today to talk with us about his latest book, The Power of Regret, which is featured on jpmorgan's 2022 Summer Reading List. Dan, welcome.
Hey, Jeff. Good to be with you.
Now, you've written 7 books, translated into 41 languages. It looks like most of the copies are on the shelf behind you. And they all explore the intersection of work, psychology, and society. You've got a very popular TED Talk. It's one of the most watched of all times. I know that people often talk to me about your book, Drive. I often recommend your book, When. Now you've ventured into the world of 4-word titles. Let's dive into The Power of Regret. This book centers around a very popular and well-worn life philosophy, no regrets, and essentially rejects it. What inspired you to explore this concept?
It was really a mix of things. I mean, part of it was personal. From some of the writing that you've done and working with behavioral scientists that at some level, all research is me search, right? So for me, part of it was that I had regrets myself. I was at a moment in my life where I woke up and suddenly I had mileage on me, which was kind of shocking. I could look backward and see like there was distance there. And as I look backward, I realized, oh man, if only I'd done that, if only I'd done that. And what I found is that when I actually talked to people about my own regrets, very sheepishly, they responded in ways that really surprised me. They responded in ways that are almost the opposite of what you were talking about, the opposite of this taboo around regret. That got me interested in looking at the research. I looked at the research, and the research says very clearly that this philosophy of no regrets goes that we should never look back, that we should always be positive, is unscientific and actually an incredibly ineffective blueprint for living.
What's fascinating to me is the different mix of emotions that often come up. I love the idea research is me search, because as I read this, I projected myself into this. I thought of my moments of regret, and sometimes I recoiled and sometimes I was sort of excited by it. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about why regret is so useful and why people recoil from examining them?
At some level, they're the same, or at least that those two things grow from common roots. And let me tell you about that. So the one reason that this philosophy of no regrets is total nonsense is that regret is one of the most common emotions that human beings have. It's arguably the most common negative emotion that human beings have. I can't emphasize enough how ubiquitous it is in the human experience. Everybody has regrets. If you don't have regrets, it's a sign that your brain hasn't developed, your brain might have some damage, or you're a sociopath. I mean, truly everybody outside the category of 5-year-olds, people with neurodegenerative diseases, and sociopaths has regrets. Okay. Now that creates, I think, a really intriguing puzzle, because this thing that is ubiquitous is also, as you say, the recoiling part is also unpleasant, right? I don't like experiencing regret. Like it doesn't feel good, but that's kind of the point, because the reason something so aversive is so ubiquitous is because it's useful if we treat it right. All right. And this is the problem, I think, with negative emotions in general. And this negative emotion in particular is that we don't treat it right. So we've been sold this bill of goods that we got to be positive all the time, which is absolute nonsense. And then that we should never look back. And so a lot of us try to ignore regret. And then some of us who can't deal with ignoring regret end up getting hobbled by it, and we wallow in it. And either of those poles is a bad idea. What we want to do is we want to confront our regrets, think about our regrets, use them as signals, use them as data, as information. And when we do that, there's a huge array of benefits, particularly in business. There's evidence showing that leaning into our regrets can help us become better negotiators. Leaning into our regrets can help us become better problem solvers, better strategists, even better parents, find more meaning in life. And so what we really need to, so my mission here, such as it is to actually kind of reclaim this emotion and say, we've gotten it wrong. We have to rethink it, because if we do rethink it, we can enlist it for some really great purposes in our lives.
I think it's really important, as you're doing here, to sort of normalize these negative emotions, normalize all these feelings, whether it's regret or, in our world, people that may have fear about volatility in markets would like not to just move right to it's okay, don't worry about it, but why is that negative there and what can we do with it? Maybe we move on, maybe we dig in. And that's what I love about this book is you prescribe ways to do a little bit of both.
And what's also, I mean, can I just pick up on one thing that you're saying there, because you might have hit on one of the most important things. That's sort of what I want to do in this body of ideas is normalize regret. Using your word, Jeff, I want to normalize regret. Why do I want to normalize regret? Because it's normal. That's the thing. And so I want to try to remove the stigma from it because it's so normal. It's so human. It's so part of our cognitive machinery.
Yeah. And what I think is important about this book and your work in general is that you take this feeling that it's normal and you move it from what I will roughly call pop psychology to real research. Part of this was you did a survey, qualitative collection of over 16,000 people talking about their regrets from 105 countries. So it's not just what you're observing in your bias and limited view, it's what the world is telling you. There's a lot that is unpacked in the book about this, and I wonder if we could maybe start with what was the most surprising thing you learned from looking at all the data that came in?
Yeah, I mean, so when I collected these regrets and they keep coming in, Jeff, I mean, we now have over 20,000 regrets from people in 109 countries. It's unbelievable.
I got another 5 for you when you're ready.
The biggest surprise to me of this giant database of regrets is how universal the regrets are. That is in a way, like it's an interesting question, I think. Like, how are we surprised? I don't want to get all like metaphysical on you, but how do well, actually I do, but I recognize that's annoying. But how are we surprised? One way to be surprised is to look for something and have it not be there. Another way to be surprised is to not look for something and have it be there. And that's sort of what and in both cases, that's what I found. I did a piece of quantitative research where I was looking for demographic differences, and there weren't many. I was shocked by that. Then I did this qualitative piece of research, and I, just looking for individuality. And what I found was universality in some sense, that if I were to show you this database, okay, so pop up the Qualtrics database, put it on the screen, and block out the fields that showed the gender identity and the age and the location, I think that you would have a hard time saying, okay, one of these people is a 53-year-old man in Baltimore, and the other is a 27-year-old woman in Kuala Lumpur. I think you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That's the thing that really surprised me.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks again to that universality, the normalcy of this being out there for everyone. I'm curious, particularly for a lot of our viewers, about some career-related regrets. Are there any universally or otherwise really particular ones that keep coming up in career, and how can someone reframe those regrets in a way to make them useful?
Yeah, it's a really good and important question. And in some level, the regrets that I found in the qualitative survey, there were 4 regrets that kept coming up over and over again. They actually, all 4 of these deeper regrets would express themselves in careers. But let me give you a couple of examples of it. I think that the biggest kind of career regret was a career regret about boldness. And it usually sounded something like this. I mean, literally hundreds around the world. I stayed in this lackluster job when I really wanted to go out on my own and start my own business, but I was too chicken to do that. And now I regret it. Huge numbers of regrets about taking more career risks, not being more entrepreneurial, not starting one's own business. That was a big category. A decent number of regrets about people who at work regret not speaking up, not asserting themselves. Yeah, those kinds of regrets. So those are ultimately regrets about boldness that end up being expressed in the career realm. There also are more than I would have expected. And I think it's super interesting. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of, is a guy. I just happen to remember this specific one out of these 20,000 because it really stuck with me. There's a 62-year-old guy in Pennsylvania who said that he had worked at the same place for 30 years, but realized he doesn't consider anybody he works with a close friend, that he regrets like not developing that relationship. And so you have more regrets than I expected about losing touch with former colleagues, not building affinity with current colleagues, that kind of thing.
That's interesting. As I see sort of in my limited view of sort of public dialogue, it's like, I want to have friends at work, and others are like, no, you're just my work people. I want to have friends outside, but 30 years at one place is a lot. You sort of touch on, I think, 2 of your 4 major types of regret. Could you walk us through what those 4 are, and maybe a little bit of how we might reframe them?
Sure. So one is what I call foundation regrets, which are if only I'd done the work. These are regrets about small decisions early that lead to bad consequences later. So one of the most common is people, I spent too much and saved too little. So finance regrets. Regrets about not taking care of one's health. Some regrets about not working hard enough in school. So things that destabilize your platform. The boldness regrets are the second category. I mentioned those. Those are if only I'd taken the chance. These are regrets that people have, as I mentioned, about not starting businesses, not speaking up, but also in other realms of life, not traveling, not going on adventures, not asking people out on dates. The third category are moral regrets. If only I'd done the right thing. These are regrets. You're at a juncture. You can do the right thing. You can do the wrong thing. When people do the wrong thing, most of us, I'm convinced of it, the vast majority of us regret it when we do the wrong thing. And then finally, our connection regrets, which are if only I'd reached out, which are about the full spectrum of relationships in our lives. And I think what's interesting about these regrets, at least my argument is that when people tell you what they regret the most, they're telling you what they value the most. And so all of these regrets tell us, like, what do people want out of life? And I think what they want is some stability. That's foundation. They want a chance to learn and grow and lead a psychologically rich life. That's, not waste their time on this planet. That's boldness. Morality, they want to be good. I think that most of us are moral animals. And then finally, the fourth one, connection regrets are really about love, and not only about romantic love, but about the love we have for a lot of people, including, I have to say, it's a dicey topic that HR people don't want to talk about, but the love we have for our colleagues.
Yeah, it's not the same love as for a spouse.
But no way.
It's a connection.
It shouldn't be, and there's research on that. There's research on this. It's known as quote companionate love. That is, I think that in some ways our notions of love are too constricted. We cabin love mostly as romantic love and occasionally as like the love between parents and children. But there are other people in our lives whom we love, and that ends up, I don't know if I would have said that 3 years ago, but looking at these regrets, it's so clear to me that these regrets about connections are ultimately regrets about love, the love we have for our siblings or our cousins, sometimes our friends, especially.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was part of this, but down the road, it'd be interesting to see the effect of the pandemic when we couldn't have those relationships. Like, we worked really hard to make the very close ones, but we missed out on the others. But I don't want to get too tangential. One thing about the way you described all that just then was you framed it how, this negative thing is really about a positive. What you regret is what you value. And that's wonderful for us to know in that abstract theoretical way. But as you also know, these theoretical thoughts aren't always what actually make us have decisions and drive our decisions in the moment, right? So a lot of times when people are faced with facing their regrets, it's that negative. It's the what I don't want to deal with. Are there any ways that you might suggest those of us that want to examine our regrets but are afraid of the bad feelings and the negativity to either reframe it to a positive, or how do we get to that point where we recognize there's something I can do with this, even though it's hard and painful right now?
Yeah, the science teaches us ways to do that, and it's not even that complicated, and it's something that I wish I had learned decades ago. The first step is essentially how we frame the regret and ourselves. When we make a mistake, particularly, the high achievers who are looking at your reading list for guidance. All right. When people like that make mistakes, screw up, setbacks, the way we talk to ourselves is brutal. Like, we talk to ourselves in ways that we would never talk to another human being. If I were to use my self-talk in a workplace, I'd be fired. Okay. And so there's a whole line of research in what's called self-compassion. It essentially says this: treat yourself initially in the face of this regret, treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Now, we have a hard time doing that. And what the research says is don't treat yourself better than anybody else, but don't treat yourself worse than anybody else. Why would you talk to yourself in a way you would never talk to anybody else? Don't do that. Treat yourself with kindness rather than contempt. Recognize that your mistakes are part of the human condition. That's another, I think, really crucial thing that I discovered here. So I think about my own regrets, and then I have this database of 20,000, and any regret that I have, boom, I'll find the same one almost instantly somewhere in the world, because I'm not that special. I'm part of the human condition. And then finally, recognize that your missteps and screw ups are a moment in your life, not the full measure of your life. And when we do that, that can arrest this march toward rumination and open the way to other steps, which involve making sense of the regret and then also extracting a lesson from it.
Part of what you prescribe in the book is what you call self-distancing. And that really resonated with me in some of the work that I've been involved with when I think about like sunk costs. Right, a lot of times people have sunk costs, and people suggest, those that are well versed in it, to basically like, what would you tell someone else if they were in this position, or maybe what would you say if you were starting from this moment now without all the history? And I wonder, sort of a couple of things to unpack there. One is regret a type of sunk cost? And also, can you tell us a little bit more about self-distancing as a technique? Because I don't think I really explained it that well.
Yeah, it's really interesting whether regret is a sunk cost. I haven't thought about that, and I'm not sure. I think sometimes it can be, other times other times it can't. I think of it more as a signal. And actually leaning into there's actually some research showing that when we regret falling for the sunk cost fallacy, we're less likely to make it later on. So regret can actually help you steer around that sunk cost fallacy. On the self-distancing, here's what's going on underneath it. I mean, you alluded to it, is this, that human beings are pretty good problem solvers, but we stink at solving our own problems. And the reason we stink at solving our own problems is that we're too close to them. We're enmeshed in the details. And so a technique for solving your own problems is exactly as you say, is self-distancing, which is taking a step back, actually doing some kinds of mental gymnastics to essentially become somebody else. So one example would be talking to yourself in the third person. So if you're deciding what to do, instead of saying to yourself, what should I do? You should say, what should Jeff do? As goofy as that sounds, there's a lot of evidence that that's an effective technique. You hit on what I think is the single best decision-making heuristic there is, which is when you're trying to make a decision. Okay, so let's talk about this in regret. You've treated yourself with kindness rather than contempt. You've recognized that it's part of the human condition. You know it's just a moment. It's not the full measure of your life. You've disclosed the regret. You've talked about it. You've written about it to move it from abstract to concrete. Now you have to draw a lesson from it. And to do that, I think the single best decision-making tool there is ask yourself, what would I tell my best friend to do? What would I tell my best friend to do? It's amazing to me how often, like this goes way beyond regret. It's amazing to me how often I get people who come to me and say, oh, Dan, I don't know, should I do this? Should I do that? And I say, well, what would you tell your best friend to do? And they say, well, that's easy. I tell her, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, hello, that's what you should do. There's a legendary business decision, leadership decision heuristic, forgive that 50-cent word, from Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, who, when he was faced with a vexing decision, would ask himself, what would my successor do? Again, moving out like that. So I'm a big fan of that I'm a big fan of the self-distancing technique because it's simple, it's cheap, and there's a pile of evidence that it's effective.
I love that. I think it's really an important tool because people that have gotten this far down the road of examining their regrets are already, I believe, inherently sensitive and thoughtful people and self-examining. And just that next step, they're the type of people that would give good advice to others.
So
That's a great point.
Just a couple last questions. A lot of our viewers are concerned not just about themselves, but also they're raising kids. And I wonder if your book is great because it's not just diagnosing a problem; it's very prescriptive. Are there any particular techniques that parents might use to help convey some of these lessons and practices to their kids, whether they be teenagers or in their 20s? I mean, besides obviously having them read the book, any sort of best practices in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked that because I think it's extraordinarily important. If you look, you mentioned teenagers. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers on teenage mental health problems in America, it's staggering. I mean, it is alarming. And I think a reason for it is that we have not equipped people to deal with negative emotions. We especially our kids, we haven't started from the very, from the time that they're little saying, oh, you're feeling bad right now. That emotion is called anger. I feel anger sometimes too. Here's what I do when I feel anger. We say, oh, don't worry about it. Be positive. Oh, it's all shake it up, And I think what's happened with many young people is that they feel the spear of a negative emotion, whether it's regret or shame or fear or anything. And they look around and say, wait a second, that's weird. Everybody else is so perfect. I'm feeling this. There must be something wrong with me. And so normalizing negative emotions as a part of life, as a fundamental part of life, I think is really important. So how can parents do that? I think one thing that parents can do is to talk about their own regrets. So to say to their kids, but talk about them in a very productive way.
Not I regret having kids. You shouldn't start with I regret having kids.
Yeah. Well, you know what? What's interesting about that, you're sending me down a tangent, is how few of those regrets there were. There were, like, out of 20,000, I think there were maybe 2 or 3 people who regretted having kids. Way more people regretted not having kids. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of interesting. That's kind of interesting in and of itself. But if you say to your kids, here's a regret that I have, here's what I learned from it, and here's what I'm going to do about it. Mm-hmm. That's powerful. That itself is powerful. The other thing more broadly is, let's go back to self-compassion. I really believe we need to teach our children self-compassion. What we've done is we've gone to the two dangerous poles. One of them is self-criticism. We think that self-criticism improves performance, and there's almost no evidence that it does. Lacerating self-criticism doesn't do much good. But especially with parents and coaches and teachers, we've completely over-indexed on self-esteem. Self-esteem is not bad inherently, but it's not that great. It's kind of vacuous. What we should be doing is teaching our kids self-compassion. Treat yourself with kindness, recognize that setbacks are part of life, recognize that any kind of mistake is a moment, it's not the full measure. And if we give kids those kinds of habits of the heart, then I really think that their own mental health, their well-being, their ability to contribute later in their life is going to go up.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't my intention with that question, but as you're speaking, I heard a thread between the previous discussion about, like, how would you advise someone else and how do parents advise kids? And a lot of what you're saying can almost be, I for myself, because I need to do that for myself, teach myself the lesson, break it down, have self-compassion. There's so much great prescriptive stuff in the book. I don't want to take up too much of your time or give away too many secrets. The book, again, is The Power of Regret. Before we let you go, I have to ask, for those of us that are interested, which I think is everyone, what, if any, what books are on your summer reading list, besides obviously all the different language versions of your own?
Well, I mean, obviously at the top of the list are the other books that you've chosen. Those are number one. But beyond that, I actually have a couple of them here. In the summer, I'm a big fan. I read a decent amount of fiction. So one book I'm psyched about is this book right here, Dan Shawn's novel called Sleepwalk. Dan Shawn is a really smart novelist. He does stuff sort of on the juncture of, like, science fiction, horror, social commentary. He's just a great writer. And then I've been meaning to read this, which is George Saunders' book on sort of the elements of a story. Where he looks at it's sort of a reprise of a class that he taught at Syracuse about how stories function. So I'm going a little kind of literary and artsy this summer.
I agree. The summer's not for the heavy thinking. It's for the good digging in books. Before we say goodbye, I want to make sure that you don't have any regrets about this conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to sort of leave us with as a last thought or something we might have left out?
Well, first, thank you for including this book on your list. That's one thing. The second thing is that if you want to do something, I really, going back to the parent thing, is like, especially if you're a business leader, you have people who are reporting to you. I want to go back to this idea of normalizing regrets. One of the most important things you can do is, have a meeting and tell people about a regret that you have. If you're in a position of authority, here's the regret that I have. Here's what I learned from it. Here's what I'm going to do about it. And I actually think I've seen that is often the catalyst of some of the richest, most engaging, most productive conversations that people have in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think your books explicitly or implicitly do a great job of normalizing being human so we can be the best humans possible. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for having me.
And thank all of you for watching our JPMorgan 2022 Summer Reading List series. We hope you'll join us again for another exciting interview on one of our other upcoming books. Take care.